Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some preseason cuts for the San Jose Sharks. As we get closer and closer to the regular season, it was unnecessary for the Sharks to carry this many players on their roster. And so with just 2 games left on the preseason schedule, the Sharks will likely be looking to find some actual regular season chemistry and do not need these players who are not likely to play the starting game for the Sharks and very well aren't even likely to play any game for the Sharks this season. And so a large chunk of players were sent down. Now, first of all, this includes the players who likely didn't really have much NHL aspirations in the first place, which is not much of an insult. This is still a very important role to fill, which is those AHL players to help shore up the Barracuda's weaknesses, which are very much existent. And this is limited to the players like Bailey, Castles, Kaspic, Sabourin, and Todd. A couple of these players did have solid training camps. Both Bailey and Todd were impressive in their own right and should hopefully help out the Barracuda in trying to get back to the playoffs, because while the Sharks are unlikely to do that themselves, having their AHL team manage to do so would be quite good. But let's discuss the players who are still those AHL type of cuts, but maybe have more of a future with the San Jose Sharks as a franchise. And we will start off with Shakir Dulan, who everybody who has talked about him has felt he has had a pretty impressive camp, whether that be Sharks reporters, Sharks coaching staff, Sharks fans. Everyone has been impressed with what Dulan has brought to the table, but he gets sent down anyway, which is really not that much of a surprise. Obviously, with the comments that Quinn made a couple of days ago, it was expected to have happen, and with the massive traffic jam of defense up front, Dulan will be better served getting major ice time with the San Jose Barracuda this season, and he will likely have a very real shot of being able to make the team come next season. The next cut was here Danil Gushchin. Now, coming into this year, he was my dark horse to be able to make it to the team. He had a very short stint of just 2 games last year at the end of last season, and he was very impressive in those 2 games, and I was hopeful that a full time off over the offseason would help him sort of really take that next step and actually become a good player for the San Jose Sharks. It would have obviously taken a Herculean effort during the preseason for him to actually earn a spot come game 1, but if it was good enough, even a game 1 start didn't happen, I thought that he could very well be like a mid-season call-up if worse comes to worse. But Gushchin was at best mediocre throughout both the rookie face-off tournament and the preseason games that he played, which is definitely a downturn from where he was in those couple of games in the NHL. So a player who I was, thinking was that dark horse to be able to at some point make an impact with the Sharks team this upcoming season, it looks less likely now, and he'll end up probably just in a large role with the Barracuda. The next player on this list is Magnus Chrona, one of the goaltenders. As I mentioned at the end of my last preseason review, it was extremely likely, about 99.9% chance, that the Sharks would head into next season with both Kaapo Kähkönen and Mackenzie Blackwood as their goaltending tandem, but that Chrona had the most impressive of the 4 preseason games and definitely looked very solid in net. So while he is not going to be an NHL goaltender this season unless multiple injuries do occur, he should be a guy that the Barracuda look to be perhaps not the starting goaltender, as he will likely be competing with another goaltender on this list, Eetu Mäkiniemi, but someone who could get some games and hopefully will put up some solid numbers. Next is Tristan Robins, who had a very mediocre camp as well, kind of similar to Gushchin, but I would say that the hopes were not as high for Robins as they were for Gushchin. Robins played a lot. He played the first 3 preseason games of the season, surprisingly enough, the only player to actually do so, and never really made much of an impact. Obviously wasn't put in a massive position to succeed, was stuck in the bottom 6 through all 3 of those games, but still nothing super impressive, and in his short NHL stint last year, also not anything particularly impressive, so will likely end up being a sort of middle 6 to top 6 player for the San Jose Barracuda, and I'm not sure if he'll ever actually factor into the NHL. That could still remain to be seen over these next couple of years, but this particular season wasn't exactly the step forward that he was likely hoping for. Next is Ozzy Weisblatt, the first-round pick from a few years ago now. The first couple of years of not being able to make the team, not that much of a surprise. Last year, not being able to make it, still not the end of the world. But this year, it still seems as though that development hasn't really gone anywhere, and he continues to just be sort of a energy type of guy who's not still good enough to be able to play in the bottom six at the NHL level. And 4 years removed from his draft year, I'm not exactly sure if that's ever going to happen. Now, this is obviously somewhat sad because he was a first-round pick, but it is important to remember that as a first-round pick, he was the last first-round pick in his particular draft year. It was the Lightning first-round draft pick, and they had won the Stanley Cup in that particular season, so it ends up being last pick. And so the expectations, while high-ish, should not have necessarily been super high, and so it is definitely disappointing to see Weisblatt not exactly amount to anything, though there is technically still time, but not exactly the end of the world either. Next, we have Haltunen, a player drafted just this past season, just a couple of months ago, had some moments with a decently solid rookie face-off tournament in the preseason, definitely a bit of a drop-off. As an 18-year-old player, he certainly still has a lot of time to develop, and he has some pretty solid skills, in particular his shot, that can definitely help him become a productive forward in the NHL in the future, but likely not for at least another couple of years. Next on the list is Gannon Larocque, another defenseman who definitely didn't have the same level of aspirations of making the NHL squad like Mukama Dulan, but another sort of casualty of the logjam at defense. Larocque had a pretty good rookie face-off tournament in the preseason, slight step back, didn't necessarily feel at home at the sort of NHL level, even preseason NHL level, so he'll send down to the Barracuda, likely play a top 4 role with them, and hopefully do some good things. Next is Brandon Coe, and throughout his career, which has lasted a few years since the Sharks drafted him, I haven't really ever been impressed with Coe. The two other players that were kind of with him in the conversation in juniors a few years ago was Gustafsson and Robins. Gustafsson has had more hopes. Robins has been pretty good, but Coe has never really lived up to any juniors' expectations, and it feels as though he's much more of a just AHL forward at this point of his career. Next is Ethan Cardwell, who had a very nice rookie face-off tournament, a couple of appearances in preseason games where he looked decent enough, and so generally Cardwell is a player who I still have some hope about. He's kind of similar in that Ozzy Weisblatt mold, but I feel as though Cardwell has actually surpassed Weisblatt on the depth chart at this point, and so while he's not going to be making an impact with the San Jose Sharks this season, perhaps next year or even the year after that could be finally the one that allows him to break through, but he does still need to continue to take those steps forward developmentally, something that Weisblatt didn't actually do if he wants to be able to make that team eventually. Then we have Adam Raska, who didn't really have much of a productive preseason, only played a single game, did okay, but really not all that great. So again, much more of a just AHL forward at this point. Then there is Romanov, another goaltender for the Sharks. Did actually get one of the 4 preseason games here. Was not particularly impressive at all. And so with the fact that the Sharks are now sending 3 goaltenders back to the Barracuda, Makiniemi, Krona, and Romanov definitely seems to be the odd man out in that goaltending tandem, and he'll likely be sitting on the bench for much of the season. Then there is Makiniemi, who did not get to play any preseason games, I believe due to an injury that was ailing him. He was the starter for the San Jose Barracuda last season, so it is expected that he'll be able to do that again, but he may end up splitting time with the more impressive, but likely the only player who actually was able to show something in the preseason, Magnus Krona. And then finally, the last cut was Nick Cicek, who kind of doesn't really feel like in the same category as some of these other players. Cicek is not exactly as much of a prospect, I feel, as much as he's more of like a floater 8th or 9th defenseman on the team. Another casualty of the logjam at defense for the San Jose Sharks. Not exactly as high of a priority on the depth charts as Mukama Dulan and Larocque are. Those are 2 players who actually have sort of NHL potential, while Cicek is more of an AHL type of guy, I feel, and he'll hopefully help out the Barracuda there. But that will do it for these training camp and preseason cuts. The San Jose Sharks now have a massively reduced roster roster. Still a couple of players up there who are not to be factoring in for the Sharks this season, but haven't yet been sent down due to injury. For instance, a player like Quentin Musty, who unfortunately did not get to play any preseason games due to his injury. He'll likely be heading back to juniors very, very soon. But otherwise, the Sharks are getting close to that starting roster. Players like Bordeleau and Eklund have sort of made it now to the final round of training camp cuts, and we'll see if they manage to make that final jump to making the team. Class dismissed.